We are happy to be sitting here with Mr. Alex Baum, the head of the delegation of the European Union to Botswana and SADC. Welcome.
Thank you.
How we usually start with the interviews is with the major roles and responsibilities of the EU delegation to Botswana and SADC. So please share some of the points with us.
Yeah, okay. No, thank you very much. Now, the European Union delegation here in Botswana, in fact on the ground since 1982, is now covering the relations of the European Union with Botswana. Relations in all their aspects, which includes development cooperation, our traditional relations, but also trade and political relations. We also cover relations with SADC, because SADC Secretariat is located here in Gaborone. And our main programs with SADC, beyond the usual political dialogue that we have with SADC, is a comprehensive regional cooperation program, where the SADC Secretariat is our direct counterpart. So our, let's say, the spheres of relations is not just development cooperation, that is where we come from, but it is very much now, and increasingly so, economic relations and political relations. Botswana is one of the, let's say, ACP countries that joined initially the Lomé Convention in 1975, and since that time we have a comprehensive development cooperation, and we can say that we have accompanied Botswana for 40 years out of the almost 50 years of its independence in supporting its economic growth, its governance and so on. In various sectors, from education to natural resources and major public sector reforms and so on. That is where we come from. The cooperation, the traditional cooperation, is by tendency declining as the per capita income of Botswana has been increasing. For the next European Development Fund that we are currently programming, and that covers the period up till 2020, we have actually a relatively small envelope now of 33 million euro, which could, of course, change. It could be more, could be less, but basically the cornerstone of our relationship becomes less important in the long run. This shall be replaced, hopefully, with more, let's say, economic relations. We will hopefully sign sometime in the first half of next year the economic partnership agreement with 6 SADC countries, Botswana being one of them. And I believe that this will be a foundation, another, let's say, treaty type of foundation for more economic relations built on trade and investments. On the political side, we do have good political relations, as you know, since the Lisbon Treaty. The delegation also represents the European Union in its foreign policy, in its common foreign and security policy. Here, the relations are, I would say, without problem. I mean, we are friends, we are cooperating very much in international fora, in the UN and so on. I would describe those relations as completely without problems, which is not necessarily common across the continent. So we are friends, and I think that's a very strong pillar on which we can also build, hopefully, stronger economic relations. The investments were significant. We are still in through a sector budget support program, so we are no longer in, let's say, the project mode. We have helped the government within the context of that sector support also to develop the education sector training development plan, as it is called, ETSSP, which is now the blueprint for the reform of the sector. Yeah, so here we will most likely continue to be present. We had also a very strong involvement, let's say, in the natural resource sector, in setting up national parks and their facilities and so on. Cooperation which has been very important in, let's say, in the earlier years, but it basically was phased out, I would say, in 2008, 9, 10, and now we are no longer in that sector. Currently, we are also supporting, let's say, Botswana as a country in the non-state actor field. So we are currently helping what has now become Business Botswana to build capacity, yeah, and to reach out to small and medium-sized companies and to support their growth. Still initially under the previous version of Bokim, when it was Chamber of Commerce. This cooperation will definitely continue in one or the other form, not necessarily only with Business Botswana, but here let's say the economic agenda that will hopefully be stronger through the economic partnership agreement will also be complemented by supporting, let's say, the economic actors in Botswana and also other, let's say, classical infrastructure projects. There is some potential. The bank could expand its operations here in Botswana quite significantly, provided that the government would be open to it. I mean, openness of the government is restricted through the constitutional limitation on foreign loans, and which is part of course, also the stability-oriented macroeconomic policy of the country. So it's quite justifiable. But it puts a limit on the engagement of European Investment Bank. But having said so, it doesn't mean that there cannot be more, let's say, in the private sector field where not necessarily guarantees are required. So European Investment Bank is very interested. They come regularly here and assess the situation and see what else and what more they can do. Yeah? In broader terms, I would say there is definitely more potential for, let's say, European investors coming in through packages, and it doesn't have to be necessarily through European Investment Bank. It can also come through other, let's say, commercial banks in Europe. Botswana has a very high standing in terms of its, let's say, the ranking done by the rating agencies. So in macroeconomic terms, Botswana is considered as a low-risk environment for commercial banks as well. So there is a potential also to have access to relatively, comparably cheap, let's say, private financial institutions.
What are the major challenges Botswana faces at the moment, and how do you think they can be overcome?
Yeah. No, there are various dimensions in it. It is correct that the environment in Botswana should normally be very positive for foreign investors, mainly through its conservative and stability-oriented macroeconomic policies, both fiscal and monetary, and political stability. Yeah. So the starting point is a very strong one by continental comparison. There are still quite a bit of hurdles in terms of, let's say, doing business, and the World Bank's Doing Business Index reflects those. The government has taken this on, and they have developed together with the bank a roadmap for addressing those, let's say, more technical issues, very often translating into red tape and bureaucratic measures that can be addressed if the political will is there, and I think it is there. They will most likely disappear one by one. So we would expect that Botswana will move up in the Doing Business Index that is maintained by the bank. But having said that, there are of course always challenges, let's say, for the economy. At the moment, the economy is relatively, let's say, fragile because it's built on fragile in terms of the sources of income. Yeah, for the government, there are two main sources, which is diamonds and SACU revenues, basically providing about 60% of the budget. In the long run, the economy will have to diversify in order to become less dependent. This is also government policy. There's a strong, let's say, economic diversification drive, as the government calls it. There has already been some degree of diversification. So it's not that we start here from scratch. Yeah? There has been a modest diversification, but it's not sufficient in the long run. In order to sustain growth they will have to have more sectors, a broader based, let's say, economic engagement, and that will require foreign investors, because let's say the capacity, to some extent also the capital, is not there to do that at a massive scale. Yeah. Where are the challenges? I think on the utility side, and that is also well known, I mean water, electricity notably, where major investments need to be undertaken. I think that is also on the radar screen. There are issues of, let's say, restrictive immigration policy, which is, I think, also being reflected on at the moment to optimize, let's say, the issuance of work permits. So what I can see is that most of the, let's say, challenges that the economy is facing are pretty much on the radar screen of government. Now the challenge is to actually do it. Yeah, and that will take a bit of time, investment and persistence. Let's say at the moment we don't have as yet an economic partnership agreement signed. The negotiations were finished. Now what we call the legal scrubbing has been finished a couple of weeks ago. So we have a final text we can work on in terms of preparing for it. Signature is at the moment envisaged sometime at the end of the first half of next year, hopefully May, June. Hopefully here in Cabo, which would be, you know, also very important for the region and for the country to take ownership. At the moment, Botswana enjoys already the unilateral market access through the market access regulation. So they can, in terms of goods, access the European market already. The economic partnership agreement will, with its much more favorable rules of origin, allow, let's say, exports to the European Union benefiting from, let's say, being integrated into the value chain of more complex production. For products to be, let's say, sourced, manufactured, exported solely from Botswana, that's a major challenge. The economy is not, let's say, big enough. The market here is also not big enough for doing that just like that. Yeah, so there are different avenues for the country to diversify its economy, and one of them being integrated into the value chains of the region. Yeah. So there are a number of opportunities that are deriving from this. Also, the economic partnership agreement has more, let's say, elements than just trading in goods. Yeah. There are other components like services, like let's say intellectual property rights, and so on. There's a broad array of provisions that can be utilized, you know, for potential exports of both services and goods. The hope is that the economic partnership agreement, first of all, provides a platform for a stronger policy dialogue. Yeah? Policy dialogue meaning that we must be able to discuss with government what are actually the conditions required for, let's say, European investors to come here. And more European investors to come here, because some are already here. Huh? I mean, the challenge is to get new investors, not for the existing ones to expand a little bit. That will not provide enough source. Yeah? So we need to have a stronger dialogue. And there is a mechanism for this built into the EPA agreement, but I would like to see this also at bilateral level. At the end, the success of the agreement can only be measured in the figures, yeah, in the trade figures, in investment and trade figures. So I would hope that we will have more foreign investments from Europe, yeah, and more exports to Europe, but there will also be a complement of more imports from Europe. Yeah. We will support, of course, the government in making this happen. Yeah. The EPA contains a lot of technical provisions that are not so simple to let's say, understand and to implement. And I think we will focus probably next year and the year after to help prepare the government, you know, on the technical side to implement the agreement, but also for the private sector to understand where its opportunities are. Yeah? So there is a lot of work to be done in the earlier phase of the agreement, just before we sign, but then also immediately after we sign. And then we hope that this will eventually take off and that we can demonstrate that it actually has an impact on exports.
Well, considering the historic relations between the EU, Botswana and SADC and the partnership agreement you're working on that you expect to be signed in the end of early next year, what personal message would you like to send to the European Times investment audience, exactly those who expect to benefit from this agreement?
Yeah. No, I mean, first of all, the main message is here is an interesting country. It doesn't have, let's say, a huge market. I mean, the population is not huge, but it has a very interesting level of income. It has very, let's say, strong conditions for foreign investors, as I mentioned before, in terms of stability-oriented policies, political stability, and a relatively liberal financial system. I would challenge European investors to study the new provisions of the, let's say, economic partnership agreement, and come here and explore, and understand the conditions that are existing in the country. I would like to see more interest from European private sector also. For us here as the European Union delegation to have a stronger dialogue with government. A strong and substantive policy dialogue with government requires interest from both sides. And we as Europeans also have to demonstrate that we are interested in Botswana. And so from that point of view, I would like to see more European investors here, which will also, let's say, be better for a stronger dialogue at the political level.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for this interview.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you.